Ever looked at the city around you and wondered, not just about the buildings and streets, but how did this whole thing actually get here? What are the deeper forces that shaped it all? That's really the question we're tackling today on the deep dive.
Yeah, and we've pulled together some really interesting sources for this. We've got academic texts digging into urbanization policy, legal stuff, and historical accounts tracing how cities grew. We'll be focusing quite a bit on Turkey today, and specifically the incredible story of Istanbul's changes.
Right. So our mission here is to kind of boil down the key insights, isn't it? How cities started, how they've changed, how planning and maybe sheer luck or disaster shaped the world we see now. We want to connect those dots, from the past to what you see outside your window today. So, okay, let's start at the beginning. Where does the idea of a city even come from? What kicks it off?
Well, fundamentally, a huge part of it is economics. At its core, you can think of a city as like a central hub, an engine, really. It's where goods and services get produced, moved around, consumed, basically meeting society's needs as they change over time.
Okay, so it's like a marketplace that grows legs.
Sort of, yeah.
Yeah.
The geographer Manuel Castells, for instance, he defined a city basically by its concentration of people doing things other than farming, non-agricultural work, and spatially packed together.
Right, moving beyond just growing food. And Karl Marx, he had a strong take on this economic engine idea, didn't he?
Oh, definitely. For Marx, cities weren't just economic hubs. They were crucially centers of power, too. He saw their rise as intrinsically tied to capitalism developing. A system of production that wasn't directly tied to owning land in the old way. The real driver for Marx was that ongoing capitalist production process and the social relationships it created. So yeah, cities weren't just for trading, they were arenas where economic systems shaped who had the power.
Okay, so cities pop up as these economic and power centers, pulling people in. But what about the people actually living in them? Like in ancient Greece, the polis, what did it mean to be a citizen there?
Citizenship was absolutely central in the Greek polis. Aristotle, the philosopher, he basically argued that if you were excluded from the political life, from governing the polis, you were sort of outside its definition.
Wow, that's pretty strict. So just living there didn't make you a citizen with rights.
Exactly, not at all. In ancient Greece, being a citizen meant having political rights, having a say. But, and this is key, it was really limited. We're talking free, adult, males. That's it. Women, children, foreigners, slaves, they were all outside that circle.
So a world away from how we think about citizenship now. And did this vary, say, between Athens and Sparta?
Yeah, there were differences. Athens and Sparta were both major players, but Athens leaned more towards oligarchy, ruled by a few. Sparta, interestingly, might have seen some earlier forms of popular will, maybe linked to Lycurgus's reforms way back in the 8th century BCE. But the fundamental idea of the Greek city was this community of, theoretically, equal citizens involved in governing themselves, like a small state, really self-sufficient and very participatory.
Almost like hyper-local democracy in a way? What about Roman cities? Similar idea.
Some similarities, sure, especially around civic identity. But they had their own flavor, especially as Rome grew into this massive republic and then empire. They even talked about an ideal population size, maybe 10,000 people. The thinking was it made it easier for the state to, keep tabs on private land.
Interesting.
And physically, Roman cities, like the Greek ones, had clear functions. Think of the Acropolis in Greece, that high fortified spot.
Right, the citadel.
Yeah, with palaces, temples. It shows how important that high ground was for
Yeah.
defense, but also, symbolically, for power.
Makes sense. Practical and symbolic. Okay, let's jump way forward. The medieval city feels very different, doesn't it?
Oh, completely. The Renaissance really shook things up, transformed that medieval setup. You get a new economic structure emerging,
More trade.
definitely, and a new political order, a different way of looking at the world. The trade bourgeoisie, the merchants, they become more powerful. The old guilds start to lose influence. And central authorities, kings and such, start pulling power away from those independent city-states that were common in feudal Europe. Cities grew, trade boomed, but it wasn't always pretty. Living conditions could be pretty grim, sanitation-wise.
Sounds like a messy but crucial transition. And then we get to the postmodern city. What makes that distinct?
That's another big leap. Postmodernism brings a restructuring, a diversification, new kinds of work, new identities for cities. A key thing is the huge emphasis on image, on aesthetics, and much more cultural diversity than before.
Image and culture driving things. How did
Well,
that happen?
Well, technology played a massive role, especially information and communication tech. It changed how people lived and interacted in cities, fundamentally. So you see this focus on, how the city looks, how it feels, and the rise of spaces built for consuming things, for leisure.
Like shopping malls, theme parks.
Exactly. Malls, theme parks, museums, the whole culture industry thing. And it also drew a new kind of middle class back into city centers.
Right, the city as an experience, not just a place to work or live. And there was a pushback against the earlier modern cities too, wasn't there? A feeling they were a bit bland.
Precisely. Postmodern thinkers criticized modernism's focus on pure function, on sometimes rigid planning. They argued it led to alienation. They talked about a lack of color, this kind of visual sameness. And that critique really fueled transformation projects focused on culture, on tourism. That really took off from the 80s. By the 2000s, this culture industry idea was central. Cities started using their history, their image, as key assets to redefine themselves.
Fascinating how the driving forces just keep shifting. Okay, let's rewind a bit. What happened during those periods between the big eras? Like after Rome declined, did cities just disappear?
Well, the historian Henri Pirenne had an interesting take. He argued that even when things got unstable, leading up to the 8th century, cities didn't just vanish. They often hung on, maybe smaller, less vibrant. Sometimes you even saw bits of the old Roman administration surviving.
So they had a kind of staying power. And then the church becomes a major urban force.
That's right. Around the 9th century, trade really weakened, and the church stepped into that power vacuum in many places. Cities transformed into these episcopal centers run by bishops. Monasteries became key hubs. Settlements often looked more like villages than bustling cities, honestly. The church's focus was naturally on religious duty, spiritual stuff, not so much on, promoting worldly trade or good living in the secular sense.
A completely different logic for organizing urban life. Then the world map changes again with the age of exploration. How did that impact cities?
Dramatically. Those 15th and 16th century voyages just redrew the global trade map. After Spain and Portugal's initial dominance, you see Northern European powers rising, England, France, the Netherlands. They started trading all over, setting up colonies in Southeast Asia, Africa, the Americas.
So new geography, new urban power centers, and this is when we get mercantilism.
Yep, the 16th and 17th centuries. Nation states are forming, national trade becomes key, and you get this economic theory, mercantilism. It was more materialistic, focused on the state accumulating wealth, not the old feudal lords. The explorations and new trade routes fueled this, and a core idea was basically zero-sum. For one country to get rich, another had to get poorer. That thinking drove colonization, controlling trade. Cities like Barcelona, Naples, they really reflect this era's development patterns.
A global competition with cities as the main playing pieces. Okay, fast forward again. 19th century Europe. Huge urbanization, right?
Massive. After the 1850s, you see this incredible wave of people moving from the countryside to cities across Europe. It put enormous pressure on everything, huge public health issues, terrible housing shortages, a real mess in many places.
But then planning starts to step in.
Exactly. Between about 1870 and 1880, you see the first real attempts at modern cities through systematic urban planning. Certain cities became magnets for big business, banks, insurance firms, industry headquarters. They all started clustering in these new central business districts. That's kind of the birth of the modern downtown we recognize.
It's a classic image. And after World War II, how did things evolve then?
Post-war urbanization was heavily shaped by national development policies, and where industries decided to set up shop. The move from rural to urban areas kept going strong, and you started seeing more and more really large cities, metropolitan areas. But by the 1960s, new patterns started showing up. Suburbs with housing subdivisions, shopping centers popping up outside the old downtowns, designated industrial parks. The city started to spread out.
The sprawl begins, and then globalization hits hard. How does that change the urban picture?
Post-1980 is another distinct phase. You have international capital flowing much more freely. Many countries switch focus from trying to make everything themselves to boosting exports. Large infrastructure projects become more common. This leads to a kind of urbanization heavily driven by capital, by private sector investment.
What does that look like on the ground?
More hotels, more shopping malls, big business centers, but it also often increased class divisions within cities. You also see the rise of the white-collar service sector, new middle classes, and how public services are funded starts to change, often becoming more challenging under liberal economic policies.
And this is when we hear about global cities.
Precisely. That shift from Fordism mass production, big factories, to post-Fordism, which is more flexible, production spread out geographically. That really accelerated in the 80s. You might think globalization makes cities less important, but actually kind of concentrated power. Financial control, Advanced services, they clustered in a few key places. So cities like London, Paris, Frankfurt, Hong Kong, Singapore, and others became these global cities, the command centers for the global economy.
Interesting. So instead of flattening things out, it created new peaks in the urban network. And what about manufacturing? Where did that go?
Well, production became internationalized. Different bits of making one thing could happen in different countries.
Yeah.
But the labor needed for all this, it's overwhelmingly in cities, not the countryside. Cities became the spatial hubs of this global economy. They expanded into what we now call city regions, interconnected networks that are the economic engines of entire nations. You hear terms like metropolitan areas, urban basins. These reflect that expanded reality. And this trend of concentration in world cities, megacities, looks set to continue.
It's like the world's economic bloodstream flows mainly through these big urban centers. Okay, let's zoom in now on Turkey, on Istanbul. You said fires and earthquakes were huge factors in Ottoman times.
Huge. Especially in Istanbul, disasters like fires and earthquakes literally reshaped the city over and over. Take Beyoğlu. It had tons of major fires. The one in 1870 near Taksim Galatasaray was massive. It spread like crazy because so many buildings were wooden.
Total devastation.
Pretty much. But that destruction actually cleared the way for redevelopment. Wealthier people, businesses, bought up the land, built new places, often in stone or brick. That fire is a big reason Beyoğlu looks the way it does now. Those famous passages, Atlas, Çiçek, Avrupa, they mostly came about after that fire.
So destruction clears the slate for something new. And around this time, the Ottomans are looking towards Europe more, aren't they, for ideas?
Yes, definitely. The Tanzimat reforms of the 19th century were all about modernization. The idea of decentralization started to take hold. The state wanted to move away from just direct control towards more standardized policies. And they needed better ways to deal with growing urban problems, adopting ideas from Europe about governance. It was partly external influence, partly internal pressure. The old Ottoman ways just weren't coping with the complexity of modernizing cities.
So they start borrowing structures from Europe. What specific steps did they take legally?
Some key laws were the Vilayet Nizamnamesi in 1864, and then the Cürsedet Belediye Kanunu and others in 1877. These were crucial because for the first time, they gave municipalities legal personality. They weren't just arms of the central government anymore. They had their own rights and responsibilities. The 1864 law reorganized provinces. The 1877 laws, especially the one for Istanbul, Cürsedet, were really focused on tackling the city's problems. They gave municipalities power over things like construction rules, public works, sanitation, managing property, collecting revenue, even things like census, markets, hygiene, fire safety schools. Building modern, clean, well-run cities became a major goal after Tanzimat.
Laying the groundwork for modern city management. And then the Republic is founded in the 1920s. That brings another wave of change.
A massive one. Ottoman modernization was more top-level, institutional. The Republic aimed for a total transformation of society, really, to meet what they saw as Western standards. Nation building was the central project. And the new Turkish middle class became really influential in shaping urban development, state policies, city values, everything. You could see that nation-building drive in the key policies of the era.
What were the first big urban priorities for the new Republic?
Right after the Republic was established, there was a flurry of laws about municipalities, some general, some just for Ankara, the new capital. They faced two huge challenges straight away: rebuilding Western Anatolian cities wrecked by war, and the massive job of turning Ankara into a proper modern capital. Between about 1924 and 1928, you get the first wave of laws on local government and planning. One of the very first was the village law in 24, interestingly.
Focusing on rural areas first?
Seems so. Yeah. But also in 24, a law on municipal taxes and fees, trying to make municipalities more financially independent. Then amendments to the old Ottoman buildings law in 25, a waters law in 26, making municipalities responsible for water supply. Also in 26, Ataturk pushed for the Emlak ve Eğitim Bankası, the real estate and orphans bank, to get the state involved in housing finance.
Setting up the financial tools?
Exactly. The first census in 1927 showed Turkey was still overwhelmingly rural, maybe 75%. Then the early 30s brought 5 key modernist laws: the municipalities law, the public health law, which set minimum housing standards, the buildings and roads law, the municipal bank law, and a law regulating engineers and architects. Oh, and in 1940, they started thinking about a regional plan for the Zonguldak coal area, Turkey's first attempt at regional planning.
A real legislative blitz, building a modern nation, literally brick by brick. And actual city plans were being drawn up too.
Absolutely. In the 30s, housing cooperatives were big, especially in Ankara's new modern districts like Baslyflivler. After focusing on Ankara, they turned to Istanbul. In 1936, the famous French architect Henri Prost was brought in to create a master plan for Istanbul.
Prost, right. Was his plan fully implemented?
Not entirely, but his work between 37 and 53 was hugely influential. He planned the historical peninsula, had ideas for the whole city's future, plans for the Bosphorus, zoning for industry on the Golden Horn, port proposals. He also pushed for that 40-meter height limit to protect Istanbul's skyline and set up the Sultanahmet Archaeological Park. Lots of road and square projects came out of his plans, too. Some of his ideas for the historical peninsula Galata Bayolu, Eyüp, were actually put into action during the 1950s under the Democrat Party. Things around Hagia Sophia, Ataturk Boulevard, Eminönü Square, new parks.
So, laying down these big visions, but then things shift again in the 1980s. Neoliberalism arrives. How did that change planning in Turkey?
Big time. The neoliberal policies of the 80s meant huge shifts in economic policy, and that forced changes everywhere, including planning. The Herzl government started privatizing state companies, and the 80s in Turkey were just known for zoning amnesties, 17 of them, that really undermined comprehensive long-term planning.
17, wow.
Yeah. Upper-level strategic planning basically got replaced by these smaller improvement plans, especially after the 1983 amnesty law. These plans were often pitched as ways to fix up Gizli areas, the informal settlements. But mostly, they targeted Gizli neighborhoods that were close to fancier housing areas, transforming those specific spots.
So, targeted interventions rather than a big-picture approach?
Pretty much. The government, after the 1980 coup, passed a whole slate of laws that reshaped cities. A new zoning law, tourism incentive law, Bosphorus zoning law, mass housing law, cultural heritage protection law. Later came privatization, the coastal law. This is when you start seeing high-rise buildings really changing city skylines. But at the same time, all those amnesties just kept encouraging, even legalizing, informal building. The 1984 zoning amnesty law basically signaled a move away from comprehensive planning.
It sounds like a definite move away from that controlled, maybe more top-down approach towards something more market-led, less regulated.
That's a good way to put it. And the longer-term effects. Well, regulations after 2004 especially led to much higher building and population density. Natural habitats shrank farmland, forests. Within cities, all the high-rises started blocking wind corridors. Building in riverbeds didn't help either. These things made cities more vulnerable to floods, earthquakes, the effects of climate change, and, controversially, the legal link requiring lower-scale plans to strictly follow upper-scale plans was weakened, making strategic planning less effective in practice.
A real departure from earlier planning ideals. Okay, let's step back and think about planning itself. What does it actually mean, and how has that idea changed?
Well, planning as a distinct field, especially modern planning, really took shape in the 20th century. Some academics, like Ickes and Sommel, argue it came about as a way to intervene in the capitalist system.
To counterbalance the market.
Kind of, yeah. To try and deal with the inequalities the market tends to produce. At its heart, planning is often seen as a rational process trying to guide outcomes, as Soyak put it. Or, as Kurz described it, using society's collective intelligence to manage resources better.
So guiding development, trying to fix the downsides of just letting the market run wild. But those early planning theories had flaws, right?
Oh, sure. Classical planning theory got criticized. It was often seen as too deterministic thinking it could perfectly predict and control the future, which is impossible. It also tended to focus heavily on the physical stuff, zoning, infrastructure, maybe not enough on the complex social and economic forces.
Like seeing the city as just lines on a map.
A bit like that, yeah. And the tools they used could sometimes be too rigid, hindering development instead of guiding it. Plus, the political role of the planner was often downplayed. They were seen as neutral experts, not actors in a political game.
More technical, less political or social initially. How did that evolve?
Well, the Great Depression in 1929 made state interventions seem more necessary. So after the 1930s, you start seeing broader, more comprehensive planning theories emerge. The goal shifted towards actively tackling social and spatial problems using technical know-how, all for the public good. The idea was that a plan wasn't just about land use. It had to consider social, economic, political dimensions too. It became a tool for more integrated development, a series of rational decisions, as Kellis described it.
A much bigger, more joined-up vision for planning, but still tricky.
Definitely. A major hurdle was just how hard it is to predict the future accurately over, say, 20 or 25 years. Cities are complex, things change, unexpected events can easily make even the best long-term plans seem outdated or irrelevant, so plans often drifted from their original goals.
Predicting the future is tough, especially for cities. So what came next in planning theory? Something more flexible.
Exactly. The criticisms of those long-term plans led to what's called midterm planning theory. It tried to bridge the gap between the big 2025-year master plans and shorter 5-year development plans. Midterm planning aimed for shorter time frames, more flexibility, being able to adapt as things changed. It was more incremental, allowing adjustments based on feedback.
A more adaptive approach. And what about influential figures like Le Corbusier? What was his big idea?
Le Corbusier's famous vertical city concept involved packing people in quite densely, maybe 300 people per acre, using very tall buildings. The idea was that this would free up most of the ground, like 95%, for green space. The high-rises themselves would only take up about 5% of the land.
Wow, mostly Parkland then.
That was the vision. He also imagined lower density, fancy housing and courtyards for the rich, still leaving lots of open space. Restaurants, theaters, integrated into it all. It was influential, emphasizing public space and efficiency. But it also got criticized, for potentially disconnecting people from the ground and for its social implications.
That tension between density and connection to nature seems like a constant challenge. And how did planning theory change again towards the end of the 20th century?
After the 1980s, planning took another turn, reflecting those bigger shifts in economics and social thinking. We talked about neoliberalism taking hold. The basic principles of planning were often rethought, moving away from the welfare state era's approaches. And the debates were really shaped by new social movements and postmodern ideas about cities and society.
So, wider culture and politics started feeding back into planning ideas more strongly. Okay, back to Istanbul specifically. We talked about historical maps. What do they really show us about the city's planning?
Well, you can divide them roughly. Before 1776, you get these descriptive engravings, more about the look than precise scale. After 1776, you start getting scaled maps, much more accurate. The first scaled one was Koffer's in 1776. Then you have others like Barbier du Bocage's, von Moltke's map in the 1830s, Dostoya's map of Biolu. A really important one was the first modern cadastral map done by the 6th Municipal Department between 1861 and 76. Very detailed.
Cadastral means showing property boundaries, right?
Exactly. Then there's Huber's maps. Charles Goade's fire insurance maps from the early 1900s, super detailed for risk assessment. A Bosphorus map from around 1909-22. The German Blues from 1911-13. Jacques Previtich's insurance maps between the wars. Even guidebooks by Mambury and Osman Nuri Urgent included maps, and later aerial survey maps. It's a long list, but together they show this increasing need for accuracy and detail over time for running the city, building infrastructure, managing risk.
A whole history just in maps. And you mentioned the historical topography being important for planning.
Crucial, especially for a city like Istanbul with its hills and water. You need to understand the lie of the land. It wasn't just professional map makers. Travelers, scholars studying the East, archaeologists, they all documented the city, often using maps to record what they saw. Joseph von Hammer-Purgstall, the Austrian scholar, used Koffer's maps in his big history of the Ottomans. So maps were tools for history, for understanding power, not just for getting around.
More than just navigation tools, then. You singled out the Goad maps. Why were they so key for Istanbul?
Because foreign insurance companies needed to know the fire risk. They hired Goad's London firm to make these incredibly detailed plans between 1904 and 1906. They're basically the first maps focused specifically on fire hazards in Istanbul. Very practical for the insurers.
Makes sense. Risk assessment via maps. And the German Blues, great name. What were they?
They were made by a German company between about 1913 and 1921, meant to be a solid base for planning efforts. They're called the German Blues because of the blue borders on the sheets. These were incredibly detailed colored maps, 1 to 1,000, 1 to 500 scale. Showed everything: streets, buildings, neighborhoods, palaces, embassies, police stations, fire stations, mosques, churches, synagogues, military sites, hospitals. Even building footprints and names. An amazing snapshot of the city then.
Unbelievably detailed. Must be gold for historians. Now, you mentioned Semdil Topuzlu, the mayor. Bit controversial.
Yeah, he was mayor for a significant period. The story goes the Grand Vizier saw Topuzlu's own fancy house and thought, anyone who can build like that can run the city. So he became mayor. This was also a time when people started getting more vocal about preserving old stuff. Asari Atika, ancient artifacts.
But Topuzlu wasn't so keen on preserving everything.
Not always. He was known for knocking down old buildings to make wide avenues and squares. He apparently complained about not being allowed to demolish a bathhouse in Sultanahmet because he wanted the square to look like the Place de la Concorde in Paris. Shows a clash between modernization and preservation.
That tension again. Progress versus heritage. And Previtich's maps also linked to insurance.
Yes, Jacques made these cadastral-based insurance maps between 1922 and 1945. Covered big areas like Beşiktaş, Beyazıt, Üsküdar, Kadıköy, Beyoğlu, Eminönü. Reinsurance companies use them first to figure out risk in whole areas. But today, they're super valuable for architects, planners, historians. They show the city's fabric in detail from that interwar period.
From risk tool to historical treasure. Okay, moving to the 1950s. Big changes happening in Istanbul then, too.
Definitely. The urban operations starting in 1956 had three main goals: ease traffic, open up space around big mosques and squares, and restore religious buildings. This meant a lot of expropriation, knocking buildings down. Sometimes historic ones got sacrificed for new, wide roads, 30, 50 meters wide.
Prioritizing cars.
Seems like it. Some public squares basically became big intersections. Motorized transport was becoming king as car numbers grew. Interestingly, the prime minister then, Menderes, supposedly thought building a metro was a waste of money, that the roadworks were enough. History proved that wrong, didn't it?
Hindsight is 2020. A city built around the car, with consequences. What happened with formal planning after that, in the later decades?
Well, after the master plan bureaus were closed down by the 1985 zoning law, comprehensive planning for big cities like Istanbul really fragmented and slowed down. Then a law in 1987 allowed direct granting of title deeds in areas covered by those improvement plans or just based on cadastral surveys. Basically, between 1980 and 2000, under those neoliberal policies, the driving force shifted. It wasn't so much the public sector leading, but individual entrepreneurs, the market.
Planning became more bottom-up, or maybe just more fragmented.
More fragmented, definitely. Less holistic. Planning became more localized, piecemeal. The laws passed, then really cemented that trend.
A real change in who held the reins. And after 2000, what's characterized planning and development more recently?
The post-2000 period, with its new laws, looks a bit like the post-80s era in direction. Still broadly neoliberal. But a key difference is why. The post-80s changes were more about domestic needs, the coup's aftermath. Post-2000 laws, much more influenced by outside factors.
Like what?
The EU, globalization, international capital, looking for places to invest. These later laws were shaped by those external demands, and the big theme became urban transformation, large-scale redevelopment. A huge trigger for this focus was the terrible 1999 Marmara earthquake. It made addressing disaster risk absolutely urgent.
So external pressures plus the need for safety driving things recently. Turkey's planning story certainly seems full of twists and turns.
It really is. It's evolved massively. There's been this clear shift towards project-based development. In the 80s, planning was maybe reacting more to immediate grassroots issues. Post-2000, you see the EU, global capital, having a much bigger say in the agenda.
A fascinating journey. Okay, let's pivot now to the social side. How do ideas like society and class connect with how cities develop?
All right, this is crucial. We need to look at social stratification, how societies are divided, and how that links to the city. How does class show up in urban space? How does the city become a place where these struggles play out? And how does class even form within the city? Historically, you see shifts, right? From master-slave and agricultural societies to lord-serf in feudal times, and then bourgeois proletariat in modern Western capitalism.
So the economy shapes the social structure. What are the main ways societies get stratified?
Sociologists point to a few things: how specialized jobs are, what the society mainly focuses on, religion, politics, economy, how much social distance there is between groups, if opportunities are equal, how much solidarity people feel with others like them. Based on that, you get types like caste, slavery, estate, or zumre in Turkish, and class.
Okay, break those down.
Sure. Caste, think traditional India, is inherited status, almost zero mobility. Slavery, like parts of historical North America, rigid, legal ownership of people. Estate systems, feudal Europe hierarchies, tied often to land with different rights. And class systems, emerging with industry, are theoretically more open. Status based on birth and achievement, allowing mobility, though big inequalities often remain.
So potentially more movement, but inequality persists. How did the Industrial Revolution specifically change cities and class?
Fundamentally, Marx, in the Communist Manifesto, talked about two main new classes emerging directly from industrialization. The bourgeoisie, the capitalists owning the factories, the means of production, and the proletariat workers owning nothing but their labor, forced to sell it to survive.
The owners and the workers.
Basically, yeah. He saw them as the main upper and lower layers of modern Western society. The old middle class was kind of transitional. Later, you get more complexity, white-collar jobs, skilled versus unskilled workers. For Marx, the economy, the relations of production is the base, the infrastructure. Everything else, institutions, laws, politics, ideas, is the superstructure built on top.
Yeah.
And class conflict, for him, was the engine driving history.
Right. And he had that interesting view on cities replacing rural life.
Yeah, he and Engels saw capitalism moving into the countryside as almost liberating people from what they called rural idiocy. City growth was seen as progress, breaking down old structures.
A pretty harsh take on rural life. How do other sociological views compare on stratification and inequality?
Well, you can contrast Marx with the functionalists. Marxists see stratification rooted in who owns the means of production. Inequality is the problem, to be solved by ending private property in a communist system where production meets needs. Functionalists like Davis and Moore argue stratification and some inequality are actually necessary for society to function.
Necessary. How so?
They argue the most important jobs need the most talented people. Stratification, with unequal rewards, provides the incentive to get those capable people into those demanding roles. So for them, inequality helps keep society stable and running smoothly.
Very different perspectives. One sees it as a problem, the other as functional. What about Max Weber's view on class? How was it different from Marx's?
Weber saw class differently, not necessarily tight-knit groups, but potential basis for collective action. For him, class position came down to life chances.
Life chances.
Yeah, your probability of getting certain economic opportunities and rewards. These chances are shaped by economic interests owning property, income opportunities in the market. So while Marx focused on owning property and production relations, Weber looked more broadly at your capacity within the market skills, education, resources, determining your class and life chances.
More about market position than just ownership. And how does social mobility fit in? People moving up or down?
Exactly. Social mobility is that movement between positions. You have upward mobility moving higher, like getting promoted or a business growing. Downward mobility falling lower, maybe losing a job, business failing. And intergenerational mobility, how children's positions compare to their parents. A worker's kid becoming a doctor, or vice versa.
Shows how fluid or rigid a society's structure is. Okay, let's bring this back to the city itself. How does class struggle happen in the urban setting?
Well, today, stratification is globalized, right? Inequalities play out on a world scale. Some groups have huge advantages, others live in poverty. And remember Lefebvre's point, capitalism is still alive as a result of its successful use of urban space. The city is key to how capitalism works. Engels, way back, predicted the working class would rise up and overthrow capitalism, seeing the city as the stage for that.
The city is a battleground, in a sense. What other perspectives are there on this?
Manuel Castells talks about how politics, ideology, and the economy all shape urban space and experience. They determine how urban services are distributed. For him, urban social movements often arise around demands for these services. Their success often depends on linking up with broader class movements.
So struggles over housing, transport, utilities.
Exactly. And David Harvey links urbanization directly to capital accumulation. He argues you can't understand how cities grow in capitalist societies without seeing how capital needs to expand and reproduce itself. He talks about the second circuit of capital. When capital from industrial production, the first circuit, can't find profitable outlets there, it often flows into fixed assets, buildings, infrastructure, land development. That's a way to deal with crises of overaccumulation. The core tension for Harvey remains labor versus capital.
So building cities becomes a way for capital to solve its own problems.
Wow.
And what about political movements in this urban context?
Harvey argues their success hinges on engaging with these urban processes. He says basically any political movement in advanced capitalism that ignores the city is doomed. It has to offer solutions to the multiple alienations of contemporary urban life to get mass support for real change.
It needs to address city life directly.
Yes. And Harvey points to things beyond just class that movements need to focus on. He also connects class consciousness forming to specific urban changes, like Haussmann's rebuilding of Paris from 1850-70. That huge project, driven by capital needing investment, didn't just change Paris physically, it pushed workers out of the center, creating more class-based neighborhoods.
So urban renewal can literally redraw the social map of a city. The city isn't just a backdrop, it's actively shaping these social dynamics.
Precisely. That's the key takeaway here. The deep historical relationship between the city, how society is stratified, and the struggles that arise from that.
A powerful connection. Okay, let's switch gears back to the practicalities of planning in Turkey today. What are the different kinds of zoning plans, and how do they stack up?
Right, the basic framework comes from Zoning Law 3194 and the 2012 Spatial Planning Construction Regulation. It's a hierarchy, from broad to specific. You start with the spatial strategy plan, then the environmental arrangement plan, then the master zoning plan, and finally the implementation zoning plan.
Okay, top down, what's the spatial strategy plan? Sounds very high level.
It is. It connects national development policies and regional strategies spatially, looks at economic potential, transport, environmental limits, resources, cultural assets. It sets broad spatial strategies for different sectors and how they relate. Think big picture, schematic maps, maybe 1 to 250,000 scale or even larger, covering the whole country or large regions.
Got it. Big picture stuff. Then what about the other plans?
The environmental arrangement plan, Chef Plana, is regional. It sets out settlement patterns, land use, infrastructure, guided by that spatial strategy plan. Then the master zoning plan, Plana, is more detailed, usually at the city or municipality level. It lays out land use types, population density, transport routes, infrastructure principles. Crucially, it's the basis for the next level down.
Which is the implementation zoning plan.
Exactly. Ugalama Imar Plana. This is the most detailed. Shows specific building blocks, property lines, exactly what you can build, where height setbacks, and the precise layout of roads, pipes, etc. And legally, you have to follow the master zoning plan. You can't approve an implementation plan without a master plan in place, and it can't contradict the master plan's land use decisions.
Makes sense. A logical flow. What about plan notes? You mentioned those earlier.
Ah, yes, Plan Notlaria. Absolutely critical. They contain all the detailed rules and specs that you can't see just by looking at the map. They clarify things, detailed rules for land use, construction. They're often where the real nitty-gritty of the plan lies.
Like the instruction manual for the map.
Pretty much. And sometimes, unfortunately, you get conflicts between the map and the notes, and that can lead to legal challenges.
I can imagine. Who actually makes and approves these plans?
Metropolitan municipalities, Büyükşehir Belediyeleri, have the power to make, approve, and implement the master zoning plans within their boundaries, usually 1 to 5,000 to 1 to 25,000 scale. They have to align with the regional environmental arrangement plan. Provincial special administrations used to do the provincial environmental plans, but Law 6360 in 2012, which made many metropolitan areas cover whole provinces, shifted a lot of that power to the metropolitans.
A big change in who holds the planning power regionally. Now, I've heard the term DOP Development Partnership Share. What's that about?
Right, Düzenleme or Teklifpay DOP. It's basically a mandatory land contribution from property owners when a zoning plan is implemented. The idea is to secure land needed for public services, roads, parks, schools, that kind of stuff, generated by the new development.
So the developer contributes land for public use?
Essentially, yes. The limit is legally capped at 40% of the area being developed. But applying it can be tricky. What if the plan itself doesn't actually show enough land set aside for public services? Or if the area isn't mainly residential? Or if it's already mostly built up? Taking 40% for public use can be difficult or disruptive then.
Right, practical challenges. And if someone thinks a plan is flawed, what can they do? Can they challenge it legally?
Yes, absolutely. Because bad plans can cause real irreversible harm, there are legal ways to challenge them. Often someone will ask the court for a stay of execution, basically pausing the plan while the case is heard. The ultimate goal might be the complete cancellation of the plan if it violates planning principles or laws.
What do the courts look at?
They check if the process was fair, if the plan follows good planning principles, and if the authorities actually considered the specific local conditions. You can challenge a plan directly, or after your initial objection is rejected, or by challenging something done based on the plan, even after the main appeal deadline.
Seems like several avenues are open. What happens if a plan gets canceled after buildings have already gone up based on it?
That's where acquired rights kazanılmış haklar come in. It's a complex issue. The Council of State looks at things like, was there a valid building permit issued under the old plan, an occupancy permit? Had construction started? How far along was it? When did all this happen? They judge based on the specifics. But the basic legal principle is that cancellation is retroactive. The plan is invalid from the start.
So it's like it never existed.
Legally, yes. Any actions taken based on it become void. People affected can then apply to the authorities to sort things out based on the situation before the canceled plan.
That could get messy. Really shows why getting the plan right matters so much. Okay, let's zoom out again. Thinking about Turkey's urban transformation history, you mentioned 5 broad periods.
Yes, a way to frame it. Pre-modern, early Republican, modernization focused, post-WWII, 1980-2000, and post-2000. The pre-modern was largely unplanned, driven by big projects, trade deals, reforms like Tanzimat, public land availability, settlement policies, disasters, early industry. The Ottoman state was the main actor.
Then the Republic.
Early Republic. Heavy focus on planning, expropriation for societal transformation, westernizing society, changing roles for women, new entertainment culture, modern splendors like cafes, cinemas, the state driving it. Post-WWII, migration booms, Getektu growth, informal housing alongside state planning attempts and laws to control Disekandu. State and individual builders are key actors.
The 80s and 90s.
1980-2000. Neoliberalism hits. Less planning, more improvement plans, zoning amnesties. Lots of unregulated growth, driven by earthquakes, globalization, EU relations, individual entrepreneurs, land speculators become big players, and post-2000 continues neoliberal trends but with a renewed focus on planned transformation. Big projects, new laws, land development ramps up, driven by disaster risk perception, global capital.
Right.
Ministry of Environment, TOK, municipalities, big private investors are the main actors now.
A really clear summary of the shifting drivers over time. You mentioned disaster shaping Istanbul earlier. Can you give more specific examples?
Oh, definitely. Earthquakes were frequent. Big ones in the early 18th century caused damage. But 1719 was devastating across a wide area, hitting Istanbul, hard mosques, palaces, walls. 1766 killed thousands, and fires. With all wooden buildings, they are catastrophic. They often forced major changes to street layouts, new avenues being cut through. Sometimes historical buildings just got demolished if they were in the way of a new road or plot layout.
Which areas were particularly affected?
Traditional Jewish quarters like Kuzgunkuk, Hasko Balat got hit repeatedly. Hasko fire in 1883 wiped out over 1,000 houses. The Babanyali publishing district also burned down multiple times. But the Great Beyoğlu fire of 1870, the Haraki Kabir, was truly transformative. Destroyed maybe 8,000 buildings, homes, businesses. It really shaped modern Beyoğlu.
How so?
Reconstruction led to more stone and brick buildings. Districts like Şişli and Nişantaşı started growing as alternatives. Many famous Beyoğlu streets were completely wiped out, Vali de Çeşme, Sakuzacakçı, and major landmarks destroyed. Nome Theater, Armenian Patriarchate, consulates, hospitals, hotels, churches. The huge empty spaces left by that fire in Taksim Galatasaray just paved the way for its redevelopment into the city's modern heart.
So these terrible events inadvertently spurred major urban change. Going back to the early republic's transformation drive, can you give more examples of that shift towards a Western lifestyle in cities?
Sure. You saw women becoming much more visible in public life, interacting more freely with men than was typical before. A whole new entertainment culture emerged. Modern social spots popped up, especially in Istanbul first. Places like Enchi Pastanesi, Marquis Pastanesi in Beyoğlu were early examples.
Cafes, pastry shops as social hubs.
Exactly. And Istanbul became the center for Turkey's new cinema industry. The Melek Cinema, later Emek, opened in Beyoğlu in 1924. Casino culture also developed. The Ankara Gargazinosu was a big, popular venue in the 40s. It all reflected changing social norms, new ways of spending leisure time in the modernizing city.
A deliberate cultivation of a different urban experience. Now, post-1950s, you mentioned migration and Gesekündü growth intensifying.
Hugely. The 50s saw rural migration to Istanbul really ramp up. Gesekündü settlements spread rapidly on the edges. It led to a kind of ruralization of the outskirts as people brought their customs with them. It also fueled speculative building yapsaçlık people, quickly throwing up basic housing, often in these informal areas.
Were there laws trying to deal with this?
Yes. The first specific Gesekündü law was for Ankara in 1948, legalizing hundreds of existing settlements. Another law in 49 dealt with demolishing unlicensed buildings. The official approach was prevention and clearance improvement. But politically, it was hard to actually demolish large settlements. Populism often got in the way.
So formal policies met political reality. What about giving Gesekündü residents title certificates?
That was part of the populist response, granting title allocation certificates often for up to 400 square meters. The idea was these would become full titles later, after improvement plans or surveys. Zoning Amnesty Law 2981 was key to this, though it was later repealed. The post-80s period added more layers: the oil crisis impact, neoliberalism, growing segregation, forced migrations, all complicating the picture further.
A constant tension between formal roles, informal growth, and politics. Let's look at the transformation laws post-2000. What do they enable?
Well, Article 73 of the Municipal Law defines urban transformation's goals broadly, creating housing, industry, tech parks, public service areas, recreation, etc. Articles 69 and 73 together basically give municipalities the scope to do land housing production and urban transformation, shaping the new urban landscape. And Law of Heavy 162 gives TOK, the Housing Development Administration, massive power. They can prepare, commission, even change zoning plans of all scales in Gisekondu transformation areas on their own land or in mass housing areas designated by governors. The only condition is maintaining environmental and zoning integrity.
So TOK becomes a major player in planning specific areas. Okay, let's shift perspective globally again. Urban conservation, how did that develop worldwide? When did people start actively trying to save old buildings and areas?
Well, the earliest motivation was often just practical, keeping something useful for longer. And powerful people or groups often protected religiously important places. Interestingly, the Romans actually moved old structures sometimes to preserve them, and they developed an appreciation for art beyond just its material value.
So early glimmers.
Right. But things stalled after Rome fell, and in the early Christian era. The Renaissance saw a revival like Cola di Rienzo mapping Roman ruins in the 14th century.
But when did it become more organized, more widespread?
Really the 20th century. The 1931 Athens Charter talked about protecting monuments in their historical context, though confusingly, the 1933 Athens Conference called some old buildings dilapidated housing and suggested tearing them down for green space.
Mixed messages there.
A bit. But World War II, with all its destruction, really boosted sensitivity to losing cultural heritage. By the 1960s, people were thinking more about monuments with their surroundings. 1975 was European Architectural Heritage Year. The Amsterdam Declaration came out of that, pushing an integrated approach. Heritage wasn't just single buildings anymore, but whole historic urban and rural areas. That led to the A Future for Our Past campaign. UNESCO followed up in 1976 with recommendations on safeguarding historic areas, and international bodies like ICOMOS, ICROM, UNESCO became key players.
A clear shift from single monuments to whole historic environments with international backing. What about Turkey's specific laws for conservation?
The main one is Law 2863 on protecting cultural and natural assets from 1983. Article 6 lists what needs protection. Things like natural formations, buildings up to the end of the 19th century, plus later buildings deemed important historically or artistically by the ministry. Also stuff in archaeological sites, places linked to national history like the War of Independence, and Ataturk's houses automatically protected. In 2011, things got split. The Ministry of Environment and Urbanization took over protecting natural assets with special commissions under the Nature Conservation Directorate. Cultural heritage stayed mostly with the Ministry of Culture and Tourism.
A division of labor there. Finally, let's talk housing policy and law in Turkey. How has the approach to housing evolved?
Okay, housing. Basic need, right? Economic and spatial aspects. Housing policies are what the state does, laws, actions to meet housing needs based on priorities. Social housing policies are part of that, usually within national plans. They target specific groups, income levels, standards, classes, and should link up with wider urban planning.
What are the key elements of social housing policy?
Generally three things: aligning with national goals, prioritizing public benefit and land use, and having clear priorities for who gets help and what kind of housing is aimed for. Policies obviously have to differ country by country, depends on industrialization, politics, etc. Understanding supply and demand is crucial too.
And how has housing changed in market economies?
It's become more of a commodity, more variety, more players involved: developers, marketers, renters, finance, speculation. The land needed often comes from city edges or by building denser, taller buildings, smaller units. Uneven development means land values fluctuate, making land speculation a big part of the housing market.
What about historical approaches elsewhere?
Well, 19th century London had tenement blocks for workers. Germany had perimeter settlements. Then the 1920-1980 period saw more public intervention. Laws brought governments into the housing game. Italy was early with public housing, pushed by socialists. Germany, after WWI, saw civil society co-ops, unions building an alternative public housing economy because the market failed, leading to a big public sector by the 20s.
So the state stepped in when the market didn't provide?
Often, yes. Social housing policies really developed between the wars. States started regulating. England, after WWII, focused heavily on settlement planning, housing standards. Post-WWII, housing shortages were massive. Everywhere, war damage, more households. Led to rent freezes, state building subsidies. Germany tried different subsidy models. England saw councils build lots of working-class housing, though rationale shifted. General need versus slum clearance, and support faded later.
And Turkey's housing story up to the 50s.
Influenced by Europe, but lagged behind. Growth was mainly Istanbul, Izmir. Housing changes were driven more by trade service growth and low-income demand. Upper-middle-class housing dominated, not the smaller European forms. Apartment blocks started appearing in the 30s. Istanbul, Ankara.
And later, up to the 80s, who built what?
Private sector mostly did middle, upper middle housing. Gizikkandu housed rural migrants. Co-ops served lower middle classes. The state supported the private sector via Emlak Kredi Bankası and laws like the 1966 condominium law. By the 70s, you had a huge illegal housing market, helped by earlier Gizikkandu amnesties. Law 775 in 1966 tried to tackle Gizikkandu but didn't really work.
What about finance?
Emlak Kredi Bankası and the Social Security Institution, SSK, were the main players, but mostly helped existing savings, didn't create a stable market. Key laws were Gizikkandu Law 66, Cooperatives Law 69, and 1 in 63 allowing services to unpermitted buildings temporarily. The planned development era failed to stop Gizikkandu, despite intentions. Result: low-quality, poorly integrated settlements tacked onto cities.
And more recently, any controversial laws?
Law 6306, about cutting services in risky areas without guaranteeing housing solutions and making homeowners pay infrastructure costs if demolished, has drawn criticism. Also, in 2010, power to declare transformation areas shifted from municipalities to the central ministry.
A complex history of trying to house a rapidly urbanizing population, with mixed results. We also have a list of some other key laws related to planning and environment. Can you quickly run through the main ones?
Sure. Law 5216 on metropolitan municipalities sets up their legal status, aims for planned coordinated services, defines what they are, the criteria, population over 750K, coordinated districts, etc. The coastal law, Kia Kanunu, deals with reclaimed land from sea, rivers. It goes to the treasury, but municipalities or metropolitans get to use it according to the law. National Parks Law, 2873 from 83, covers selecting, protecting, managing national parks, nature parks, monuments, conservation areas. Defined each. The Nature Conservation Directorate now manages these. Tourism Incentive Law, 2634, lets the council of ministers designate tourism regions area centers. Planning approvals can be faster there, and the ministry has sway over tourism zoning. Decree Law 645 set up the Ministry of Forestry and Water Affairs 2011, outlining duties, forests, erosion, nature conservation, protected areas, biodiversity, water management. Law 6831 on forests deals with land removed from forest status 2A, 2B areas, transferring them, selling them, often at discounts to eligible people. And Law 5403 on soil conservation restricts converting prime farmland to other uses, with limited exceptions needing board approval. Defense, disaster relief, oil, gas, mining, public interest projects.
A really dense web of laws covering development, environment, tourism, resources. It highlights how many factors are involved. Well, this has been an incredibly deep dive into how cities have formed and changed, especially through the lens of Turkey and Istanbul.
It really has. We've journeyed from ancient cities defined by citizenship and economics, through medieval shifts, Renaissance changes, right up to these complex, tech-driven, often fragmented, postmodern urban places we live in.
And it's so clear how economics, politics, social structures like class, and just unexpected events disasters have all profoundly shaped urban planning and development.
Absolutely. And it's not over. Urban transformation is ongoing, dynamic, especially with globalization and legal frameworks constantly evolving.
So maybe the next time you're walking around your own town or city, think about the layers beneath your feet. How does understanding this history change how you see the challenges and possibilities facing cities today? What forces, maybe hidden, are still shaping the place you call home? Definitely something to think about. Thanks for joining us on this deep dive.